I'm Julia Kirchie, representing the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law. We are excited to share with you a recorded webinar we hosted this past January with Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger on the topic of intergenerational equity and climate change commitments in Indigenous treaties with Canada. Stay tuned for more presentations and make sure to check out our Facebook page at McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law to stay up to date with upcoming webinars, as well as previous recordings on this YouTube channel. Thank you and enjoy.
Is brought to you by the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law. Today, we're so excited to announce that we have Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger, who is going to be talking to us about intergenerational equity and climate change commitments in Indigenous treaties in Canada. So to give some background of our speaker today, Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger has a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford, an MEM from Yale, a McGill Law graduate, a Bachelor of Arts from Carleton and University of Victoria. So many accomplishments, to name a few. A UNFCCC COP26 Climate Law and Governance Initiative member, an award-winning expert, jurist, and professor of law and governance on sustainable development, author and editor of 22 books and over 80 papers, including sustainable development law and sustainable development in international courts and tribunals. And today we will be going over some of Professor Cordonier Segger's work, and we will be listening to some background and then having an interactive discussion. So I'll leave it to Professor Cordonier Segger to initiate when the discussion will happen based on how everything flows. And lastly, currently Professor Cordonier Segger edits a Cambridge University Press series and serves on the editorial boards of 5 law journals. She's a professor of law at the University of Waterloo in Canada, chairs several expert commissions and the future board of bit.bio, which is a Cambridge biomedical firm, and is a former general counsel to UN treaty bodies. She advises countries on negotiating and implementing treaties on climate change, biodiversity, trade, investment, and natural resources. There is so much more I can say, but without further ado, let's hear from Professor Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, and it's wonderful to be back with the McGill Journal. As you probably know, we were just founding the Center for International Sustainable Development Law at McGill when the Sustainable Development Law Journal was also being founded. And I have always followed the progress of the journal with great support and enthusiasm and interest. So I'm really, really pleased to see the journal going strong, still led by students, still doing an incredible job of shedding light in this fascinating area of law. And I very much appreciate your very courteous invitation today. Now, as you probably know, poor Laura was introducing me, and the one detail that got left out is probably actually the more relevant one, is that I'm currently doing a visiting professorship, the Leverhulme Trust Award here in Cambridge, in the University of Cambridge, and so it's rather dark out. and you have a photograph of one of my libraries where I work from an earlier time in the day in the background. But I'm actually speaking to you from sort of 6 p.m. my time here. And what I wanted to do, and I was trying to think about what would be the most exciting way to do a webinar of this type. And I was thinking it might be of greater interest to you rather than simply hearing my thoughts on an issue that I've been worrying about and working on for a while, to maybe share with you a few starting thoughts on the topic, but then also the way that those thoughts can turn into both academic research projects and also, actual Cambridge University Press books. And so I wanted to sort of give you an idea of how these things can develop from a gleam in the eye of a group of partners and researchers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and climate change negotiators, to a SSHRC research project that funds several doctoral students in law and in sustainability management, to an actual CUP book, which is now in its sort of final phases of being researched and written. And I thought that might be of interest to you, because I remember actually one of my favorite lecturers who got me started in international law used to start every lecture with a 10-minute rant about how difficult it was to get his work published and how many footnotes he had to change. And I remember serving on journals, the Organisé and the McGill Law Journal type situations, where that was quite possibly the most useful thing he could have told us about. I mean, I loved his class, but it was his practical explanation of the types of challenges you run into when you're trying to lead legal research projects and when you're trying to actually publish your work as articles that ended up staying with me the longest. And probably a good 20 out of 24 of my books could be credited to this one professor who literally taught me how to work with editors. And of course, now I'm an editor myself, and I'm also an annoying person who reviews other people's book proposals for Oxford University Press, and an even more annoying person who now sadly reviews funding proposals for SSHRC and for multi-million pound research awards. And I'm finding that actually it was that one professor's ideas of how to manage as a young academic in an admittedly rather bizarre space that ended up sticking with me and proving most useful. So I'm going to try to speak from that perspective and hopefully start some real dialogue with you. I hope that's of interest. Now, obviously, ideally, the topic is also of interest. And I think it's probably no surprise to anyone here. I'll speak without PowerPoint slides this time to keep it a little bit less formal. That in my view, climate change is a crucial challenge for both intergenerational and intragenerational equity. And it offers the world an unprecedented opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to the principles and practice of international law and sustainable development. And that's a positive way of saying that this is the litmus test, everyone. You know, we fail on this, we fail on survival. We foul our own nest, we no longer can actually develop as civilizations. And even in the current reality that we face, and I think we all got muted suddenly. So in terms of just the current challenges that we face, it's very clear as well that the climate change, the impacts of climate change are already occurring. They're already affecting people around the world, just as we predicted in 1992, when together with Maurice Strong and many other governments, we were fighting to try to get our first international agreement on this issue. And there were very real interests arrayed against us. And they're already undermining decades of social and economic development progress where it has occurred. So when I was working as head of the International Development Law Organization's Sustainable Economic Development Department in Rome with the UN, and we were partnering with our member countries, including Vietnam, we would talk to our Vietnamese team about why legal preparedness for climate change might be necessary and what kinds of legal reforms were necessary. And one of the things that I remember very clearly, and that was really in a way, it pierced your heart, was that the leader of our team who was working in Vietnam on the reforms was a young man, a young lawyer who came from a coastal city in Vietnam. And he would start every PowerPoint presentation, even to the ministers of his cabinet, with a map of Vietnam, and painted in red were the areas that would be underwater. And then he would say, this is a map from 20 years ago. I want to show you the same map today. And of course, the map would show the areas that were underwater. And then he would point to one particular tip of one particular bit of the coastline. And he would say, this is the small city where I come from, and all of my family, and all of the people who are still below the poverty line that live nearby. And he would name the city. Oddly enough, while that is already heartrending to hear that he's facing these kinds of impacts for something that's so little responsibility, and yet trying to make a difference to still change what he can, what was more frightening was that everyone in Vietnam knew the name of this small city. That's because it had been nominated and been accepted for a very large World Bank loan to build port facilities that were now also underwater. And the country is still expected to pay back that loan of millions, more than millions. So the international structure that we have And this scenario plays out in different variations all over the world every day now. That international infrastructure that we have was built for a world in which climate change wasn't the reality that it is. We're still catching up if we really want to take intragenerational equity seriously, with some very serious challenges. One of my colleagues at Oxford when I was doing my degree, who was also very involved actually with this journal and is also now the chair of our board with the MJSDL, Ashfaq Khalfan, he's the head of legal for Amnesty International now. He did his PhD on something called odious debt, the idea that you loan money and sign contracts that will be binding, knowing that the investment that you're making and the loan that the country is taking out is never going to touch the people that it's intended for. And that concept of odious debt may be more useful than we think in terms of global equity and climate change. But what I'd like to focus on here today, and this is where I can be a little bit more practical, is perhaps just 3 points on how the international law on equity is starting to play out in some treaty regimes. And then I'd like to flip things just a little bit and say, what if we weren't just looking at international law? What if we were looking at private law of contract? What if we were looking at a different kind of treaty? For instance, the treaties that our government is signing with First Nations. And I'll end there with 2 examples of projects. Yeah? Okay. So to start then, the International Law Association, right after the Rio Earth Summit, put together a committee of experts internationally to build on the work of some very extraordinary jurists who had worked together with Gro Harlem Brundtland in the elaboration of the report, Our Common Future. And they together developed a series of principles which eventually made their way into what we call the Rio Declaration, non-binding, the classic example of soft law in international law. Those principles weren't seen as clear enough. And so for nearly a decade, we worked together through the ILA in order to be able to elaborate 7 principles of international law on sustainable development. They included many that anyone who works in this field is familiar with today. Things that are obviously rather clear in some cases, such as the principle that states have a sovereign right to develop their own natural resources, but a duty to do so in a way that doesn't harm global territories or the territories of other states, or the principle of precaution, that if there's scientific uncertainty on the possibility of harm from a particular development, the burden is on the person proposing the project to show that it's safe, not the victims. Or the principle of a common but differentiated responsibility, which holds that there are historical responsibilities for problems like climate change that are not the same depending on what benefit your country has actually received from the problem as it was being created, and the historical developments that exist previous to the actual problem existing for everyone to solve. Another principle that we identified, and one that I think is probably pretty common to most treaties related to sustainable development these days, is the one that recognizes that people should have access to information and access to opportunities to participate in decision-making about sustainable development, and of course, access to justice when things go wrong. The principle that I'd like to highlight today, and I'll match it with a second one that is quite near and dear to my heart, is the principle of equity, intergenerational and intragenerational equity. I think everybody here would understand perfectly well that the idea of intragenerational equity is that within a generation, there should be equity in the way that people are treated, the way that the resources are developed and allocated. And in terms of intergenerational equity, that equity also needs to extend between us and future generations so that we're not foreclosing on the very possibilities of, for example, life for all other future generations to come by our decision-making today, We need to respect what we can understand of the interests of future generations. This principle of equity and eradication of poverty is found pretty much all the way through international law on sustainable development. It was recognized by the ILA, together with one other important principle that I've written about a fair bit. I won't go into detail here, but it has to do with the need to integrate environment into development decision-making, and the fact that the costs of that integration need to be borne by the development project, and that the like precaution concerns that are raised when a project is proposed need to be taken seriously and actually taken into account in the planning and in the execution and in the evaluation of development decision-making, both the social and the environmental costs. That integration principle is sometimes called the sustainable development principle, which is fine too, if you want a shorthand. But I think what is important to underline is that these principles work together in a flexible way. You can find them in almost all treaty law on sustainable development, and you also can find them in many of the, increasingly, contracts and other private law arrangements related to climate change. So if we look, for example, at the decision in Glasgow and even before in Katowice of the world's international financial institutions to align all of their lending and their grants as well with the Paris Agreement commitments, one of the rather straightforward questions we have to ask is, well, are you still supporting hydrocarbons at all? Why? And we also have to be able to follow that up with, well, what are the equity and eradication of poverty implications of supporting hydrocarbons? Are you truly taking into account the social and the environmental impacts of these hydrocarbons? Or are you simply pouring money into an obsolete technology and a stranded asset? And I think it's a fair question to ask if you're a government subsidizing them too. And so we have to sort of take into account not just the principles as they run through the law, but also the principles as they help international institutions and others who are making pledges and grand statements to be able to respond to the expectations that those pledges and grand statements imply, not necessarily at the point of their PR exercise, but at the point of actually looking at the contracts themselves. One of the exciting little projects we've done along the side has been to look very carefully at the engagement of external counsel by companies and financial institutions, including banks, that have taken on pledges related to climate change. They're promising to align their spending and their lending with the Paris Agreement. So they're going to be reducing their emissions. They're going to be supporting adaptation. They're going to be encouraging financial flows toward a zero carbon world and even a carbon negative world. And yet at the same time, those pledges are not being reflected in their letters of engagement for external counsel or in the contractual chains that they sign when they set up a project and support it. Now, amusingly, before you think I'm sort of being incredibly critical here, well, the way I'm being a little critical, you could also think forward. This leads to a very simple solution set. If you've taken on a net zero commitment, let's see how it reflects itself in all of the contracts you're signing. And we can do that. Principle, access to information, public participation, access to justice or some form of remedy if there's something strange going on. But what we found is that normally, and it's been honestly as awkward and weird as you can imagine, one will be talking to the general counsel of a large financial institution and ask, do you reflect your climate pledges in your letters of engagement for external counsel or in the contractual chains when you set up projects? You don't? Well, would you like to? Oh, you would? Oh, wonderful. Well, we'll send you a few proposed provisions from one of our new research projects. Would that be helpful? You'll be very welcome. Yes, very happy to see that happen. And you could sort of see in their own head the wheels turning and thinking, oh my God, if my board heard about this, I'm the general counsel of this whole green climate fund, and I haven't been putting our climate pledges into our letters when we engage external counsel. Okay, maybe I better fix that fast. And we've seen some changes made very quickly. That's on the private law side. What is happening in a greater sense when there are commitments for intergenerational equity that also have a very strong intragenerational component. And here I'm speaking first about climate change, but second about a broader set of commitments, the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, 169 targets, many of these targets are the basic necessities that people need to live. Very quickly, you can see that not only is there an equity sustainable development goal, but there's also running through all 17 of these goals a strong commitment to the eradication of poverty and to ensure that within a generation, there's a certain level of equity, or at least less inequity, which aligns very well with the principle of equity and eradication of poverty in the ILA Declaration and in many of the treaties. And it aligns very well as well with the overall objectives of the United Nations, particularly its Economic and Social Council. So good, the SDGs are there. Good, they're addressing some of the basic needs of many peoples. And good, they're doing so in a way that sets up a framework, not legal, soft law, aspirational, that is backed by literally hundreds of international treaties. And there I'm speaking for a second again as the head of the IDLO SED, because I was looking at the SDGs as they wrote them from 2012 to 2015 on behalf of the world's law organization as part of the sort of intergovernmental family. And my main job was to help them to understand what their treaty commitments were in each area of the Sustainable Development Goals, and then to help make sure that they at least didn't go below them in these forward-thinking 2030 focused aspirational SDGs. They didn't. The SDGs either go beyond or they are at least at the level of the treaty aspiration. But then the question becomes, well, how do we implement? And we're going to take SDG 13 because it's such clearly a question of equity as our example. And SDG 13, action on climate change, involves three particular sort of targets. One related to adaptation, and also there is, at the end, one related as well to mainstreaming climate change provisions into all of our laws and policies and other places where they're needed. But there's a footnote. Lawyers love footnotes. But this particular footnote was actually referring to the regime in which the international negotiations were taking place. And in particular, it was referring to what at that time was the beginning of the actual formation of the Paris Agreement. The Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in September. The Paris Agreement was announced and signed and adopted in Paris in December. And so rather than preclude the negotiations and rather than make a decision that would actually signal too much what the negotiating red lines were in the SDGs, they simply made a note and said, the real regime where the commitments on climate change need to be found is the Paris Agreement. Didn't have that name yet. Whatever arrangement there is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we will consider that to be part of this Sustainable Development Goal, neatly incorporating the entire treaty that was yet to come in the Sustainable Development Goal on climate change. And that's what we've actually seen. I mean, the Paris Agreement does actually reflect the principle of equity in many ways. And in one of our recent books on intergenerational equity in my CEP series, we've actually gone through the Paris Agreement and analyzed how it contributes to intergenerational as well as intragenerational equity. Everything from the provisions and the regime that is set up for encouraging adaptation to climate change, but also resilience and early warning and assessment and disaster response provisions, as well as even funding and an adaptation fund to assist countries, to the commitments on mitigation and ensuring that those actions that are taken for mitigation that are reflected in the nationally determined contributions are actions that also take into account human rights. If you want to be able to set up a REDD+ project where you're swapping for money the conservation of forest and the restoration of forest, which is good on a number of levels, you don't forget the forest dwellers that actually live there and their ability to not only have a livelihood, but to be compensated for the development opportunities and to have other alternatives made available to them that don't involve cutting that same forest if you've just made a commitment internationally to preserve it for its climate mitigation benefits. So all to say, the Paris Agreement, which has some incredible provisions, not just on public participation, not just on sort of stakeholder engagement, not just on compliance, where it adopts very much, as per Glasgow, the actual mechanism that has been nearly successful in the Montreal Protocol, but also in terms of the core triangle of obligations. Action on climate change, both in terms of adaptation, resilience, and also in terms of reducing emissions, net zero, or even net carbon negative, backed by finance and a complete change in the way that finance is provided in our world, so that we're no longer supporting the kind of destructive practices that have led us to a world that is in such danger. Respaldado, supported. The word I'm looking for is a little bit more than just supported. The accountability that is there is generated by the transparency arrangements, the reporting, the monitoring, the verification. So yes, the finance is available, 100 billion a year by 2020. And we've just had a recommitment to that amount and more. 13 trillion, I think, in assets that are being discussed under direct commitments, Paris Agreement alignment, and 132 trillion that some other asset managers are committing to, that I'm a little bit more concerned about how precise they're being. So I wouldn't count that immediately. And then at the same time, we have this commitment to actually report, to verify, to monitor. I serve on a couple of bodies where part of my job is to look at projects that are meant to reduce emissions and say whether they really will, and to talk to other scientists and other law professors and others in this field in order to be able to understand that. And those commitments are fascinating because they're supporting, through the Paris Agreement compliance mechanisms, through the Paris Agreement implementation mechanisms, the achievement not just of the Paris Agreement itself on climate change, not just of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself as well, but also, of course, Sustainable Development Goal 13. And if you can trace that direct line, questions of, is this soft law, is this treaty law, is this contract with the IFIs, start to look a little bit more interesting because they're connected in the same regime. And then the question becomes, well, are we all aligned or not? Are some of us not quite aligned yet? How do we bring you into alignment? And that's where we've been in Glasgow with the Climate Law and Governance Initiative, helping to ensure that more and more the rules, the laws, the institutions that we have are being able to come into alignment with the Paris Agreement commitments. This is where I lead to the last sort of substantive piece of the puzzle, which is that one of the questions I couldn't help asking as I sat down with some of my Indigenous colleagues, professors and leaders of different First Nations communities was, I look at the world through a particular lens. I see international treaties, and it's a failing of my profession, and it's a failing of my worldview that I consider them to be rather important and binding. It's hard to get away from that when you're a lawyer. You kind of tend to say, this is a treaty, it needs to be complied with. Funny that it's probably a failing of our whole profession that we do take binding legal commitments seriously. And when I started to look at Canada's treaties with First Nations, the same question occurred to me there. Number one, how are we doing in implementing these commitments? They seem pretty important to these communities, but also to Canada. And then number two, is the alignment there, right? If I'm willing to question private law contracts and whether they're taking into account Paris Agreement commitments that the international financial institutions have made, if I'm willing to question trade agreements and see whether they're aligned with our Paris Agreement commitments and our SDGs, I should certainly be asking whether the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that include things like ending hunger and ensuring access to clean water and ensuring access to renewable energy and protecting biodiversity and life on land and making sure that fisheries resources that people depend on and life below water survive and addressing climate change. These probably are rather important to implement and comply with. And if the treaties that we have signed with First Nations are aligned with the SDGs, then this is no longer about charity, is it? One could argue it never was. Anyone who's read the Truth and Reconciliation report should understand that pretty well. But you work in government, you run into that attitude still today. And at the same time, it's also no longer just about government programs and policy, is it? Because there's a binding element once you put something into the treaty. If we are committed to delivering on certain sustainable development goals in our treaties with First Nations, we're obligated to comply with those commitments, delivering not just on our climate change commitments, but also more broadly on the principle of inter and intragenerational equity. And so that was the beginning of the research project that I promised to end my little brief conversation with today. Together with my First Nations colleagues, the co-leader of the project is Wayne Garnon-Williams, who's one of the heads of the Indigenous and Intertribal Investment and Trade Organization. And one of my doctoral students, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today because she's in British Columbia on a different time zone, has other commitments. We were looking, Tara Dawn Atleo, we were looking at what has happened with the 20 or so modern treaties that are being signed across Canada. Do they actually support the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 13 on climate change? And if so, how are we doing on implementing them? Assuming for a second that we actually recognize these are treaties and we do have a commitment to implement them. And it's been a fascinating research project. The first part of the project involved obviously pulling a team together, lovely, during COVID. But fortunately, we were able to identify a few graduate students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are willing to work together on it. And they're now, at the moment, coding the treaties to see what provisions each of these 20-odd treaties have on climate change. And what's been fascinating to find is that, well, almost all of them have treaties that are directly, treaty provisions that are directly and indirectly related to climate change. Almost all of them have commitments to equity and the eradication of poverty, but they're different depending on the nation. And what's fun about comparative treaty analysis is usually by the time you've read about 8 or 9 of them, and certainly by the time you've read 20, you have a pretty clear idea of what the government template for a treaty was. And then you can see what the Indigenous people who were at the negotiating table fought for and won, because it's the bit that's different than the template, right? So depending on the treaty, you know, with the NISGA, you may have some commitments on forests and on co-management of natural resources and some interest in REDD+ development. While if you're looking at treaties that have been written with the Dene Nation, or if you're looking at treaties that have been written with the Tsawwassen Nation, you may have very different commitments. And that is fascinating in itself as information. But obviously, when government funding decisions about delivering on those treaties and delivering on the SDGs are being made, it's also rather useful information for our partners like the Assembly of First Nations to have at their fingertips. Oh, you've decided to give us a bit of charity and you've decided to fund, you know, a renewable energy project in our nation. Thank you. But we have this new research brief that has been put together by a team of researchers from various different universities across Canada. And it looks like this is actually a binding commitment that you've made, not just in our treaty, but in the following other 9. We've been in touch with them all, and we'd like to ask if maybe it's time for us to take a little more seriously this particular commitment and look at implementation and compliance. And that's the state of the project right now. We're researching the various different provisions that have been put into these treaties. We're analyzing them in a way that recognizes them as binding. The fact that the minister's not in the mood today has the same relevance as it would in an international compliance process when they tell me that the minister of, I don't know, Belarus is not in the mood today. It's not really particularly pertinent to the discussion of how to implement our binding commitments among those of my country, unless we want to talk about what kind of dispute settlement mechanisms are available and what kind of claims can be made. And I'm not sure that it's worth causing that much trouble just because your minister hasn't felt like signing something. Yeah, maybe run and get it signed. And that same changing of the interactional regime, that same changing of the power dynamic, then also gives us a little bit more strength for the equity that I'm going to come back to. Now, second but not last, the research project hasn't just stayed at the academic sort of level of a set of policy briefs for our First Nations partners. We've also been speaking with them, especially about opportunities to publish their work and opportunities to share some of the ideas that they're discovering and some of the creative solutions that have been found at the negotiating table in these treaties that Canada has signed with First Nations. Not just share them, but also compare them. Comparing them with treaties that have been signed in Mexico with Indigenous people, in Bangladesh with Indigenous people, in New Zealand with Indigenous people. By the way, guess which one wins in terms of super cool progressive provisions. And what we've been able to find, of course, is that there's enough there to probably make a really interesting book. So again, together with our partners, what we've been able to put together, and I'm going to stop with this bit, is a new book proposal, which has fortunately been accepted by Cambridge University Press and which we're currently working on at the moment. It looks at the urgency of the challenge and the conditions and inequities that First Nations face vis-a-vis others in their country, sort of fourth world theory. And it also looks at the contributions of international, domestic, and Indigenous law to finding a solution. It then walks us through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and also the ILO 169 Convention, and looks at in particular which aspects of those pieces of law that concern Indigenous people and those declarations that reflect customary law that concern Indigenous people can actually be used as interpretive aids for some of the treaties that have been signed. Because you need to know the context, right? And then it also looks at the Sustainable Development Goals themselves and the various different international treaties that exist on sustainable development and how they have either led to or gone beyond those treaty provisions in the SDGs. Finally, it looks at original Indigenous trade and investment agreements that have existed in North America for much longer than a country called Canada. And it looks specifically at the Indigenous law that was in place to help govern sustainable development previous to and still today, any of these other treaties that we now focus on. With that as our starting point, we then take a look at certain specific natural resources that are under threat and that contribute to the climate change crisis today. And we look in particular at what kinds of innovative provisions addressing those resources and helping us to achieve the different sustainable development goals are being piloted in Indigenous treaties, not just across Canada, but also internationally. So we have one on traditional knowledge and genetic resources. And we have a second chapter on renewable resources, renewable energy, fisheries, forests, and on art and cultural resources, as well as one on extractive industries that we're having a lot of fun with, not just hydrocarbons, coal, oil, natural gas, but also precious minerals and commodity minerals and metals. It's about as scary as it sounds. And then we've got a set of case studies of treaty implementation in key countries, where I think I should be clear that when we talk about countries, we're including nations. And some of those nations exist within the boundaries of what are traditionally called countries. And we have a set of different case studies that have been made, not just of US First Nations and Canadian First Nations, but also New Zealand Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peace agreements in the Andes as part of the transitional justice, as well as in Bangladesh and Mexico and Chile with the Mapuche people. The conclusion of the book is looking forward, and it's saying we've done the best we can to find the most innovative and the most solution-oriented proposals here. We've truth-checked them with Indigenous elders. That's the step that's still to come, as well as completing the research. And we've workshopped them with our partners from the Assembly of First Nations and others, the Maori Nation. And what we're trying to do now is to say, we're not still 50 years ago. There are examples already in practice that could be implemented, just like the Paris Agreement can be implemented. It's time to make some of those changes in the domestic law and in the domestic budgeting process that takes seriously our treaty commitments, both to addressing climate change and to delivering on the intra and intergenerational equity principle that is reflected through all of our treaty regimes. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to open to questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Amazing. I could start with one that I have off the bat. So as like a first year, I'm not familiar with how international law is enforced. And so I was wondering, when you mentioned treaty agreements being implemented into domestic contexts, how would that operation work, like step by step?
Okay, there's two sides to this. I'm going to give you the traditional proper professor answer first, and then I'll give the nuances, all right? Because obviously, you know, having worked as general counsel for a couple of treaty regimes and having run the economic development and then the sustainable development, we changed it, you know, department of an international organization. I have some observations on the traditional, you know, sort of teachings. The simple answer in terms of international law and domestic legal structures is that countries are either monist or dualist. In the dualist countries, you do need to enact local legislation in order to be able to implement a treaty. The understanding is that a country in good faith will do that as fast as they can. They've signed a treaty, they get the domestic legislation in place, and they implement the treaty. Canada is dualist. Other countries, including amusingly the United States of America, that takes a lot of hits for this, but also the DR Congo and many others, they actually have a monist system where if their country signs an international treaty, that is now law in their country. Got to follow it. And you can claim directly on it. No need for implementing legislation. So in practice, of course, that is much less simple than the way I've just described it, and particularly in federal countries where the provinces have certain jurisdictions and the federal government isn't allowed to just sign a treaty that completely dominates a certain jurisdiction. So it is an additional level of complexity. Now, your question about enforcement is a little bit more interesting, because in a way, every treaty regime will actually explain its enforcement mechanism. The one that's been most successful that I spoke about today, and I'll use that as my example, not just because it's pretty cool, but also because it has a different view of international law, which I think reflects where we're at in sustainable development and where we're at on climate change in particular, is a compliance mechanism. And we actually call it the pike, which anyone with a sort of a classical grade school education is going to be thinking of poems about fish. But actually, the pike is the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, PAICC. And the committee meets not in a punitive way in order to sort of enforce penalties on countries that are not in compliance with their Paris Agreement obligations, but rather to help the country to understand that it's out of compliance, to discuss with them why that's the case, and then to help bring them into compliance as quickly as possible. There are countries which have large aid agencies that are sitting on that committee. There are also international financial institutions that have funds that have been set up to assist with Paris Agreement compliance. And there are also countries that have a similar situation to the ones being brought in. You know, different groupings of countries throughout the negotiations have been turned into a representative body for the PAIC, so that if you are sitting there trying to explain why you, as, I don't know, Haiti, are having trouble complying after the big earthquake, our government ministry with the obligation to report, since all your records were destroyed too, you know, you've got another small island nation and another at a similar level of sort of vulnerability earthquakes who is sitting on the pike and listening to your concerns and in your explanations and able to say, yeah, okay, you're having trouble complying. We get this. Let's put in place some mechanisms to collect the data that you're now missing and to get that report in, and then to get the changes made to your energy system that you were trying to make before the earthquake. Is that helpful?
So helpful. Thank you. So it's more focused on actually getting the result than punishing directly, it seems.
Yeah, and we deliberately chose that. Quite a few of us worked very, very hard on that because we've seen the other penalty approach and we're not convinced it works. And if anyone doesn't believe me, take a look at the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO right at the moment. And it was supposedly the most punitive and the most scary and the most binding. And it's been eviscerated. So maybe cooperation might be something to try. I don't know. It's also this, I work so much in countries that don't even have a constitution or a justice ministry, right? Like that's where IDLO focuses. And so it's very hard for me to play the blame game, particularly an issue of climate change, where it's usually the countries that are having trouble with compliance that contributed the least to the problem and benefited the least from the destruction of, our climate system, right? So again, equity, right? Really? Are we going to sit around blaming them? They're like 0.08% of the world's emissions. Even per capita, they're, 1,000th the same emissions as per capita, a developed country like Canada or the US. And yet we're still going to say, oh, you're out of compliance, neener. Maybe not. Yeah. So that was what we chose for the Paris Agreement regime. It's different in different treaties. In some cases, and actually in the UNFCCC itself, you can still refer back to the International Court of Justice if you really want to. Good luck with that. I actually do have some young friends who are looking to take a case for an advisory opinion on climate change to the ICJ. That's a little different than alleging non-compliance against a developing country. That's actually going to be a very interesting project. I'll see what happens to it, but it's a very interesting project. Now, I notice we've got questions from Nicholas and from Grace. So I want to be able to, can I take both of your questions and try to answer them together? Maybe I'll take a third one too, if there's somebody else who's burning to ask, and then that way we can go ahead. Nicholas, sure.
I suppose I'll go ahead. Again, thank you very much, Professor, for coming to speak to us. It was really fascinating. I had a question about the relationship between intergenerational equity and rights discourse. Some people believe rights discourse to be a very potent kind of public tool to talk about climate change, we have a right to a safe environment. But then some people raise that perhaps it's not very feasible or a good way to speak about it because we're talking about the rights of people who are not necessarily born. So I'd be really interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
Well, I guess together with Judge Marcel Sabo and my close colleague and dear friend Alexandra Harrington, I sort of just edited a book on that, and Intergenerational Justice in Sustainable Development Treaty Implementation, advancing future generations' rights through national institutions. It's with CUP. I think I've done my job of promoting as much as I can, right? Please tell CUP if they ask that I underlined it and told you where to find it. Okay. But beyond that, I think I'm not at a time right now, especially on climate change, where I would be very willing to give up any tool in our arsenal. And I think, David Boyd, I've worked very closely with, and prior to them with John as well. And I think that the rights discourse can be incredibly powerful. And for those who are ready to implement it, or who have institutions or regional courts or a human rights commission, my goodness, knock on those doors. I don't want to sound pragmatic. I know lawyers, especially academic lawyers, we're never allowed to sound practical. But if you got a tool, please use it. It's really desperate now. Let's use everything we can. And I've looked at some of the jurisprudence coming out of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the African Court. And I think that what they're doing there is using rights to address some of these crucial justice issues. A claim in intergenerational equity straddles that. You can say, yes, there are fourth generation rights. Yes, there are rights of future generations. Edith Brown Weiss, others have written in our book about that. And you can also say, well, there are some national institutions that are in place to look out for the needs of future generations because our current political system is so short-termist. And I wouldn't say, depending on the country you're sitting in, I wouldn't say you're wrong about either of those. But beyond that, there's an element of sustainable development, an element of planning and putting together development and policy proposals and projects, and the treaty law and the contract law that backs those projects, which an intergenerational equity approach can give you, and a concern for and a care for what are the likely needs of future generations can give you, that can be part of that process in a different way than a rights claim can. And they're both needed. Don't give up your claims for rights just because somebody has sat down and they've got an environmental impact assessment, they've got a social impact assessment, and they're trying to think seven generations forward, and they're trying to integrate the mitigation measures into the development project today. Keep the arsenal ready in case you need it. At any day, that project could be run by someone who's just completely different and not convinced about their obligations in international law. And you're going to need to haul them up in front of a human rights tribunal to defend the right to a clean environment, the right to a healthy and safe, clean environment. But at the same time, if you can build in, as many First Nations do, concerns about future generations right from the start of the co-management of a natural resources project, you've done something good. And that's a worthwhile endeavor as well. So I think my answer to your question is nuanced, and quite deliberately so. But it comes partly through enough time spent working in legal systems and cultures that are not Western to know that there's actually only a couple of systems that are just complete idiots about intergenerational equity. Unfortunately, they're the dominant ones, at least in a lot of our world today. It goes along with materialism and other things, and I have equal respect for all of the others that are still out there, and if I sound like I'm talking from cultural survival, then probably I am a little shaped by those views. Yeah. And so I think that if we can learn a little more from those Indigenous laws and correct some of the things that are badly wrong with our Western legal system, it's all to the good. Yeah. And love it or hate it, individual human rights, and in some instances, maybe if we're willing to accept them, collective human rights, are part of the Western legal system. And they're needed because of other failings of the Western legal system. So I'll say that while I'm still a firm supporter of David Boyd's campaign, and of the work that those students are doing to bring a claim to the International Court of Justice on climate change. Yeah. Grace, I was going to answer both questions at once, but I had to jump in with Nicholas because he had really very, very interesting and difficult question. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for your talk, Professor. I had sort of two questions related to the last part of your talk on working on Indigenous treaties and sort of implementation of the sort of SDG climate change elements in them. And maybe I just misunderstood, but you were talking about how, were you looking specifically at modern treaties?
Yes.
So yeah. My first question is, what is sort of the implication for Indigenous nations and First Nations under the older treaties and number treaties, which might not have perhaps SDG elements, maybe at least overtly on the text? And then my second question is sort of, how can this work, and if can this help sort of support perhaps like a sort of just transition into sort of a green economy for Indigenous nations? Just because at least from my understanding and what I've read, like obviously there's very deep and controversial contestations regarding sort of non-renewable developments on First Nations land. But I also know that sort of these industries employ like a high proportion of Indigenous people, and that there are many nations, at least like nation chiefs, that are sort of pro-oil, but only often because it is much more lucrative, like right now in the short term. So I was just wondering how this sort of treaty work and SDGs can support a sort of idea of just transition.
Excellent question, Grace. And really two excellent questions. So the first clarification is the reason that we're first starting with the treaty analysis is because that's what our Indigenous partners asked us to start with. So we're sort of going, okay, But I've looked into some of the traditional treaties, the numbered treaties. And the first thing that became very clear, and then also the reason for our First Nations partners to tactfully ask about it became rather clearer, was that in COVID times, most of the Indigenous communities are closed to foreigners, to outside people. Just anyone here who doesn't understand, that includes most Canadians, okay? So to talk to people about a numbered treaty, to talk to them about the oral manifestations that were made sometimes for days before the X's were signed on what looks like a real estate transaction with the Crown. Very difficult during COVID times if you want to deal with it properly, if you will, in a way that is respectful. Because those numbered treaties, where they are supported, are based on a whole set of Indigenous law representations, of Indigenous understandings, of oral, what I would call conditions precedent to the contract, as it were. And if you don't take those into account, you have an impoverished view of that treaty and the commitments that are owed to those people, to the point that it's frankly meaningless. And I would defend that. I'm aware of the literature on both sides, and I would still defend that. So I think what we've agreed to do is to wait on looking at the traditional treaties until we can talk to the elders who can tell us what those treaties really mean, as opposed to the 1 or 2 page real estate thing, where it looks like they've just signed away everything for nothing, or for, some farm equipment. That's not what they were told. And that's not the promises that were made. It's just what's on the paper. And that's documented. It's a pretty horrific part of Canadian history, but it's documented. It has to be taken seriously. Both the oral traditions of the First Nations and also the records of what people did on behalf of the Crown that they themselves wrote down. And that's a context that we're willing to face unflinchingly, but not without the advice of the elders. You have to be very careful when you dig in those areas. When they asked us to look at the modern treaties, they were literally just saying, look, there's some really fancy treaty language in here, and we're quite happy with some of the things we achieved. We want to know how this stacks up against the SDGs and what rights it gives us. We want to know what kind of implementation mechanisms could be explored, resources that are available to do a better job of implementing. Implication there that all parties to the treaty need to do a better job, but maybe some parties need to do a little more. And then we also want to know how this matches or could be an inspiration to other First Nations, other Indigenous peoples worldwide. And these are things that a project like yours can give us. Oh, and by the way, could you also create out of, a team of Indigenous law students and non-law students, a rapid reaction facility so that we can get snowballs to throw when we need them in some of these discussions? Yeah, okay, we can create that. Great. Because sometimes questions come up that we need a legal answer to, and we just don't have the people to do it because things are busy. And it'd be great if your project could do that. Okay, we'll do it. Great. Is 3 streams of the project going simultaneously. One is the modern treaty analysis, which we've committed to do and we're doing. The second is the training and the access to information, the databases for the Indigenous and non-Indigenous law students who are actually working on it together, so that they can be that rapid reaction when they're needed. And then the third one is the slow, cautious, careful work on the traditional treaties, which we're committed to doing either, within the extended timeline of this project under COVID or beyond. But we're not going to do it in a way that's disrespectful. It has to be done with care. I probably don't need to go into some of the most recent revelations about, residential schools, etc. But in communities that are struggling right now to come to terms with some of that, it has to be done with care. And respectfully. And luckily, as lawyers, we've got some really interesting things to already be looking at in the modern treaties, so it's a good start. Grace, you had a second question, and I haven't gotten to it yet. Can you repeat just the second part of it?
It was regarding how this sort of work can support just transition for Indigenous nations and Indigenous people in non-renewable industries.
Yeah. And the simple answer is a lot of the time, the transition has to do with having an alternative already in place. You know, it's not about, as my friends from the International Renewable Energy Association keep saying, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And so the question mark is still, what renewable resources are here? What interest is there in the community, particularly among the young people in the community and the next generation of leaders, to develop those renewable, sustainable resources and livelihoods? And then what commitments are in the treaty on that? Yeah. So it's not a question of saying, you know, hi, we're here to shut down everything you do earn money from, and then talk about whether or not there are any alternatives while you starve. That's not the approach that works. And it's the same thing we're seeing worldwide. You know, oddly enough, people are unwilling to commit to that. You know, not actually so odd at all. But what they are willing to look at and interested in is what kind of alternatives are there here. Most of the time, it goes against the Indigenous laws and it goes against the values that the community is founding on to do something that is actually damaging the entire basis of life on which they depend. And so it's not that this is like this industry that everyone loves. But the most important thing in research like this is to listen and to take into account the views you're hearing. And then if you're lawyers, you look at what's in the treaty and you found yourself on what was agreed in that treaty. You don't sort of bring your own preconception and stop listening when someone's trying to explain something else. You bring an open mind, you bring the willingness to try to do your best for what the community itself is looking for. And you bring questions, you know, how sustainable is this? Has there been the sharing of benefits that was committed? Are those benefits reaching everyone? In some countries, it's very clear, you know, there's a theory of a resource curse and there's a reason for that theory. But in other areas, it's not as clear. There have been some benefits. And the question mark is it worth the costs and the impacts? Is there an alternative that is viable, that is real, that is actually owned by the people? A lot of the work, not just on, you know, what I would say are certainly environmentally unsound development projects, isn't just the only place where this is important. It's also where renewable resources are being exploited at a non-renewable rate. And that's actually almost in a way a more serious problem, but it's also one that has perhaps a more practiced solution. So some of the treaties that we're exploring set up regimes for co-management of renewable resources, forests, fisheries, you know, land, agriculture, energy, renewable energy projects. And that co-management, that co-ownership, that sort of new way of working together in partnership often brings in what many of my colleagues, including the co-editor of our book, calls Indigenous law, and what some of my government colleagues can persist in calling, you know, sort of Indigenous values or, you know, traditional beliefs. Just in case it's not clear, I go with my co-editor colleagues' view on this one. I probably didn't need to tell you that. So if we're looking carefully at these co-management arrangements, we're looking carefully at how to ensure that the exploitation of a renewable resource is being done in a sustainable, renewable way that also reflects, as we were saying before, inter- and intergenerational equity, which, by the way, my colleagues are very clear is part of Indigenous law. Then it's a question of not, you know, trying to stop an entire industry, but rather trying to bring the resources and the training and the support to bear, both in terms of Indigenous people training non-Indigenous people, as well as, you know, what you would normally consider the other way, in order to actually change the way the resource is being exploited. What's interesting is the first place where that really starts to, you know, become most challenging is actually when you look at who expects to make profits from it. and what level of profits they're expecting to collect. A lot of the unsustainable exploitation of resources that results in degradation these days is not actually because, sustainable forestry is impossible. It's because the model of that particular industry, for historical and other reasons, has been to, sort of destroy large swaths of land, kind of run everything through a wood chipper and sell it. And the minute that you question that, why do you need to do it that way? Why can't you do it where you take only the certain selected trees each year and you keep the whole forest standing? Then they're saying, well, because I don't make enough money to feel important, what? Right? And so again, the question becomes, okay, is it really about whether forestry is a bad thing, or is it about the way you're doing it that just, you can't look forward into the future with the way you're doing it? And there are people who've been on this land for millennia who actually have a right to ask you some serious questions about that. Yeah. So it does change the frame of reference for the conversation rather quickly. Thank goodness. Okay. Other questions? It's a complex area, hey? One of the most important things possibly in this entire area of research has to do with kind of an old-fashioned word, humility, where you don't say, my book, my research project is going to change everything. You say, this is the little piece I've been asked to look at, and I'm going to do the best I can together with my team. And at the end of this particular project, we will have a set of folk who are both trained and training others, including training us. And we will have a new book that people can use. And we will have been given some briefings when they were wanted by our partners on the issues that our partners identified. And that's a little piece that we've been asked to help with. And so we're going to do the best we can on that. Yeah. Without sort of, here's how you change your whole society. Go ahead. Which isn't really what our mandate is. Yeah. So next questions.
Yeah, so we have a comment in the chat from Annabelle, who says, about unsustainable forestry, the BCCA decision on the Fairy Creek struggle came out literally during this talk. The logging company's appeal was granted.
Interesting. Annabelle, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about it as like you were talking about industry and about forestry. And also earlier in your talk about how compliance is really tricky. That's just something I've been thinking about. Like once you have these big treaties, how you get people to actually respect them, whether governments or in this case. So it's like a big logging company that has secured a lot. In BC, it was granted by the provincial government. And yeah, even if at COP, at the latest COP, our government has agreed to end deforestation, we're still doing, this is full cut of old growth forest on Vancouver Island, I should say. But yeah, I was just kind of thinking about how it's tricky to be in law school listening to these talks and decisions are being made at
right now.
Time, I don't know. That was an example. I just put it in chat.
Yeah,
I was interested maybe if you have more to say about compliance and how. Yeah, well, you've talked a little bit about it, but there are so many different approaches to.
Yeah.
Getting things we agree upon done.
Yeah. Annabelle, they probably didn't give as part of the introduction a sort of a full background on what I was doing when I was 14 and 15 out in BC, hey? Let's just say that it's a good thing that your record for being arrested on logging roads gets wiped when you're 18. They had a fair bit of wiping to do with me. Well, not just logging roads, but also, ministries of forests, occupations, and dangling from the high wires above the Parliament building.
songs between the sequoia tree and the flagpole, panel banners, and
I'm actually so interested in that. Can you, like, if you feel comfortable, can you tell us about like going from there to like your positionality right now?
To
and,
general
like, these
counsel
two
and
different,
professor in Cambridge.
These two kind of spheres of change, like on the ground.
I'll be really honest. When I was protesting and organizing large-scale civil disobedience in Clayoquot Sound and the Carman and the Walbran, you know, I was 14 and I had and 15 and 16 and 17. It was a long fight. Hunger strikes, you know, and many other actions during the time. School walkouts, logging road blockades. They wrote an article about us in one of the logging magazines. It was this lovely woman who I can't believe she's still alive, said, you know, you can get angry at teenagers who are on hunger strikes and say they're just dieting. But don't let us forget Joan of Arc was 14 years old, which was super cool. And it was a woman from a resource town who was sticking out for us. But one thing that I did see, and it was partly because we were working together, not as equal partners, but as young people meeting with Indigenous elders and learning from them, just to be really clear. Even then, the arrogance couldn't be there. And you know, frankly, the minute you've been out to the Dididat territory or to a Hausat to meet with the Nuchanol, you're not saying we're a group of youth and you're a millennial old civilization that is watching us destroy your very livelihood, and you know, we're just going to meet as equals. That's not what's going on. Anybody who tells you that they do are being silly. But as young people, they were kind of kind to us and very patient with us, and they understood what we were trying to do this for and the transformation that was needed. And at a certain point, as we had continued our activism, I think it was day 21 of one of our hunger strikes, the citizens of British Columbia formed an alliance of 20, 30, I think it might have been 40,000 people, and they called themselves the Silent Majority. And they were basically saying, we really wonder what's going on in this world, that our kids have to be on hunger strikes for 21 days just to try to make it clear that, you know, forest licenses were given out by corrupt ministers who were later jailed. And yet we're still being asked to respect those forest licenses as though they were law. And it was that as though they were law that got me, right? Because then I started to think, well, you know, every time that we involve ourselves in one of these massive social struggles, and I'd studied social movements at the same time as I was studying mycology in the Pacific Forestry Research Center as an intern, you know, I could see that there was a certain point in a social change process where the citizens kind of are tired and angry and fed up, and the lawyers take over. And it seemed to me that it wasn't actually the citizens' movements that were the problem here. It was that sometimes you had good lawyers who took over and you ended up with actual social change, and the law itself changed, and you got a BC Forest Practices Code, and you got a protected area strategy, and you got a forest renewal plan that was talking about a different kind of forestry altogether, and a ban on clear-cut logging. And sometimes you got the wrong lawyers taking over, and you ended up with a bunch of greenwashing. And that was actually what made me interested in becoming a lawyer. You know, I wanted to be one of the good lawyers. And I had friends who also wanted to be good lawyers. But at that same time, I also became aware that with problems, including the British Columbia struggle for the ancient forest, it was one fight among many that were going on around the world. And while in the end, you know, my record was wiped clean, I could finish my undergrad degree, receive a whole bunch of scholarships, go to McGill, go off to Yale, go off to Oxford, get a good education. My friends who had been in Rio with me at the 1992 Earth Summit came home having criticized the Guatemalan government, and their sister's body was on their front garden, right? So it was a little bit of a different degree of urgency and a different level of rights that the people who were struggling in countries at that time, like Guatemala, and yes, my friend was Indigenous, and so was her sister. And you look around at that and you realize, all right,
there's both a local responsibility and there's a global responsibility. And it might have been a sort of an understanding that there was something more out there that made me travel by land from Canada down to Chile and then over to Brazil for the Earth Summit, and made me part of that movement in the beginning. It took a while. But it was also an understanding that we don't just solve this problem in British Columbia and the problem goes away. You know, when I moved back to BC after working in Latin America with my partners and friends after the Earth Summit, there was a mining company that was closing a large copper open pit mine on northern Vancouver Island. And the managers were on, television nearly every day saying, I know this is an environmental disaster. We need to remediate. We've destroyed so much. If we had just understood what the impacts of these technologies would have been when we started 30 years ago, we never would have adopted this sort of open pit copper mine. The cost alone of remediation is going to cost more than we ever earned out of the mine itself. And this is just terrible. And we're terribly sorry. And thank you for the government funding to help clean up the site. Right. And, okay, at that time I was 17, 18, and I was possibly a little cynical, but I was curious about this because I'd been living in Chile for a year. And guess what the same company was doing? They were opening a large scale copper open pit mine using the same technologies that they were decrying publicly on Vancouver Island. Right. So we invited a group of the activists from Chile up to do a tour of the mine and to hear the comments that were being made, and they filmed it, and it made quite a splash in Chile. But I think part of the understanding there was that, when things are handed over to the lawyers, they either change and the social movement has been successful, or they get lost. And I think the vote's still out on whether they got lost in British Columbia. I think there's still a lot of people fighting very hard. But I can also see that all over the world, these fights are happening. When Yeb Sanyo declared in Warsaw that he was going on a hunger strike, he was the head of the Philippine delegation. And the Filipino delegation had been, the government of the Philippines had been part of what we call the like-minded countries group. They're the ones who have oil resources and want to exploit them. So a charming group of countries, really constructive players in the climate change negotiations. It's a pleasure to work with them. They're so nice and clear about what they want. But the Philippines have been in that group, and Yeb had been added to the delegation, and he was the climate change commissioner of the Philippines, and he didn't quite share the view of the country as a whole. And as we were in Warsaw, Hurricane Haiyan hit, and Yeb gave a speech. He was youngish, probably. Well, I was the same age as I was. And he basically said, look, while we're debating these things, while we're talking about loss and damage and compensation liability, while we're all trying to shift responsibility and only the rich countries can preserve the forests and only the rich countries can do these things and find these solutions, my brothers are back home digging bodies out of the rubble from a hurricane that was more severe because of climate change. And I'm done here. You kick me off the delegation if you want, but I'm disgusted by my country being part of this like-minded group that wants to exploit resources. And we're crossing the floor. We're joining the highly vulnerable countries group. And I'm going on a hunger strike. And so, of course, everybody joined them. And I was head of the IDLO delegation, so the head of the International Organization delegation. And I had to contact my director general and say, look, I'm terribly sorry, Irene, but I have to go on a hunger strike now. And she said, well, that's not what we sent you to Warsaw for. And I said, I know, but, I have to tell you a story. And she said, well, okay, go ahead. Tell me a story. You're one of my trusted directors of my programs and you're the head of a department. I'll listen to your story before I fire you. And I said, well, okay. So 20 years ago, we were all teenagers fighting for the BC rainforest, and CNN came to interview us because we were all on a hunger strike. And we said, well, we have this petition and this commitment to hunger strike, and it's been signed by students all over the world, and they're all hunger striking with us. So we're not just the 26 kids you see here, we're actually hundreds across the world. And so CNN went and interviewed somebody who had signed the petition. And they went to the Ateneo School of Governance in Manila. And there they found a student whose name was Yeb Sanyo. And he was there, and he'd been occupying the office of one of the school administrators because he was hunger striking for the BC rainforest, which they called Brazil of the North. And they said, what are you doing here in the middle of Manila, striking for some kids in the middle of like British Columbia somewhere? And he said, I signed a pledge. You know, what hurts those forests hurts everyone. The Philippines forests are also being destroyed. They're standing up for me. I'm standing up for them. So, you know, sorry, CNN, your story is going to have to be, if you're honest reporters, that we really are here and we are striking with them. You know, and we saw this on the national news. That was how we found out that they'd kept their commitment. But they came through for us. And Irene said, oh, that's the same. I said, yeah, that's the same Yeb Sanyo, who's now the head of the Philippine delegation here in Warsaw. And he's asked me to strike, and I've said yes. So am I fired? And she said, you know, commitments we make to our colleagues in developing countries are important. And I said, yes, they are. You know, I sort of tried not to add more important than this job is to me, because that probably wouldn't have been very politic. And then she said, well, you know, prior to being director general of this organization, I was head of Amnesty International. And I think we have some similar values here at play. I'll let them know that you've got our permission and our support. Which led to a very strange negotiation, because, of course, you'd have to go to all these formal dinners, and about 3/4 of the table would turn their plate upside down, which showed that they were also joining the hunger strike. But by day 10, it was a bit awkward, and I did have to go and give a keynote speech to the World Bank. And one thing that I would tell you is that unless you really want to, like, well, let's put it this way. If you really care about not making, I'm not sure if they're friends or enemies, don't go and give a speech to an organization like the World Bank when you haven't eaten for 10 days. Because the one thing that sort of really does slip in about day 8 is your sense of sort of tact and diplomacy. And I think I sort of was probably a little bit more emphatic with them than I'd expected. They all sort of, they did give me a standing ovation. And quite a few of them were crying, but I'm not sure I was easy on them, if you know what I mean. So you know, that's a kind of anecdotal answer to what I think is a very real question, Annabelle, which is about how you go from recognizing that one local problem needs to be solved to realizing that you got to take on the whole issue globally, and then still standing up for your values, still continuing to try to make change, still keeping your commitments, but doing that in a way that is not just looking after one local problem, but trying to help everybody who's got the same problem. And the law can be a powerful tool, right? That's why you're still here doing a law degree rather than rushing back to BC to help change things. Because you know that the better equipped you are, the stronger your tools are, the better your arsenal is, the more of a chance you have to change things, not just by yourself, but with everybody else working on those problems at all levels. And that's part of the compliance story, right? That's part of the enforcement story. These treaties have to be made real every day by decisions that people make at all levels. And as much as possible, we want people in place who take them seriously, who take the law seriously, who take justice seriously, but who also understand what it really means to commit to sustainability. You know, that's a process. It's not just a one result and everything's fixed. Now there's Laura with her hand up, and I think she's probably going to tell us that we needed to end at 7:30.
Precisely, yeah. But feel free to continue on. But yeah, just a lot of us have classes at 2:30, so that's why our audience is like slowly dropping away. So if you have a class, feel free to head out. I do have a class at 2:00.
And I have children who need to be fed. So
but I wanted to thank you so much for your talk. It's so inspiring to hear your transition from activism to this high level of influence. I had no idea about your background in that, and that just shows it brings so much light to the issues that I find get kind of bureaucratic when you're in school and you're like, what? Like, I came here because I want to just chain myself to a bridge and like tell people that I really want this just to be fixed. And then to hear that, you know, you still bring that spirit into your work and into an otherwise kind of dry thing is really inspiring to me, and I'm sure for all of us. So thank you so much for your commitments to sustainable development. The world's lucky to have you, sincerely, and thank you for taking the time to share all of this with us.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to everybody. You know, I mean, I'm willing to share certain things based on the people who are here and what they're really interested in. And you've been an absolutely brilliant circle. Yeah. Can I ask the name of the person who has MJSDL management
Yes.
on their screen?
Yeah, my name is Juliet.
Hi, Juliet. Nice to meet you too. All right. Wonderful. Well, in that case, thanks to everyone, and I'm thank you for the really lovely comments you're putting in the chat, and I really look forward to seeing what happens with this project and to seeing the journal continue. One of your strongest supporters here.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and keep fighting for this. Let's do it. Let's fix this.
Okay. Bye for now.